as we speak. So hello, everyone. I hope you had a wonderful summer break and your semester's off to a great start. This is the September edition of the IGRI Research Seminar Series, and it's so good to see all of you back from vacation, I hope. So my name is Uta Brady. I'm a visiting scholar at Arizona State University, and I'm also IGRI's lab manager. That means that I organize these research seminars. So if you are working on something IG related, or you know somebody who is working on IG related matters and want to present your work, please feel free to contact me. We're always looking for future speakers. And with that in mind, let me introduce Silvana Peralta. She's going to be our speaker today. And Silvana is a specialist for the climate change adaptation strategy at the National Ministry of the Environment in Paraguay. She will be discussing some of her very interesting research, some of the very interesting research she did as a graduate student at the Michigan State University, where she adapted the grammar of institutions to develop an ESPECO syntax that allowed her to study constitutive statements in the context of forest laws in Paraguay. So without any further ado, let's welcome Silvana.
Hi, everyone. Very nice to meet you, and thank you for your time, and thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here, so I'm gonna start sharing my presentation now. And please tell me if everyone can see it. Yes, okay. So today I will be presenting, as Dr. Uta said, the work I did for my master thesis research, and it is called Adapting the Grammar of Institutions to Study Constitutive Statements, and I applied it to the case of forest laws in Paraguay. So this study is inspired by the work of Crawford and Ostrom, the grammar of institutions, but is focused on the study of constitutive statements, because this is a field within institution that has not been studied very often. So therefore, to do this study, I created a new syntax that I call the Ecosyntax, with the objective of better understanding nature and the role of constitutive statements in the policymaking process. And I applied this framework to the case of forest laws of Paraguay, my home country, because I was curious to know how the legislation defined the forest, that is a very complex social-ecological system. And I choose to focus on Paraguay because the country has experienced massive loss of forests over the past several decades. So the research questions motivating this study are: what will the ESPECO syntax teach us about constitutive statements? And what will the application of the ESPECO syntax teach us about the forest laws in Paraguay? So as mentioned earlier, this work is grounded on the grammar of institutions, which is a method to study institutions through the content of statements that encapsulate shared social constructs that are known as institutional statements. These institutional statements are classified into regulatory statements and constitutive statements. Constitutive statements are those in charge of creating positions, organized bodies, or definitions. They have a generative nature or form. In the other side, regulatory statements are more focused on regulating behavior. They prohibit or allow activities within certain parameters for different types of actors. So far, the grammar of institutions has been focused more on regulatory statements. And I believe the reason behind that is because the grammar of institutions was inspired by the work by von Reitz, what is centered on deontic logic, or the study of the level of permissibility of action, what is allowed and what is prohibited to do. So as a result of this, Crawford and Ostrom only focus on developing a grammar that could fit those statements in charge of regulating behavior. Thus, inspired that they recognize the existence of two types of statements regulatory and constitutive statements, they only focus on regulatory statements. As a result of this, they crafted a grammar syntax that they call the Ecosyntax to study regulatory statement. This syntax is comprised of 5 components: the attribute or the actor doing an action, the deontic or the degree of permissibility of this action, the aim, which is the action itself, the conditions or the set of parameters under which an action is allowed or not, the or else or the punitive sanction for non-compliance with an institution or rule. And as of today, a new component has been added to help clarify some ambiguities and is the object. So the ABDICO is, as of today, known as the ABDICO syntax. So in order to study constitutive statement, I first had to create a new syntax that could be the structure and the components of constitutive statements. So, as constitutive statements have different syntactical structure and functions than regulatory statements. For instance, regulatory statements are known to have a structure that is X do Y, and they have prescriptive functions. In the other side, constitutive statements have an X is Y structure, and they are definitional in character. Constitutive statements do not attempt to regulate behavior, at least not directly. So it is not possible to identify a clear actor doing any clear action. And as a result of this, it is not easy to identify some components of the ABDICO syntax of the grammar institution, such the aim and the attribute. So this is the reason why I decided to create a new syntax for constitutive statements. So this is based on the syntactical structure and components of constitutive statements. According to SIR, constitutive statements can be represented by 2 syntactical forms: X is Y or X is Y under context C. So by deconstructing this syntax into each of its components, I claim that constitutive statements are made up of at least 4 components or 4 tiers, which I will be elaborating and explaining more in the following slides. So the tier 1 encapsulates the element that is being granted a definition or characteristics or a meaning. I claim that this tier can be divided into 2 components: the subject and the subject extent. I call the subject to the animate or the inanimate actor or entity that is being defined or granted a meaning, and the subject extend to a specific dimension or aspect of this subject that is going to be defined. I believe that by partitioning this tier into 2 components may help to better identify what dimensions or aspects of what is being defined is being taken into account and which dimensions are being ignored. So the second tier contains a connector element whose function is, I believe, is only to link what is being defined with the definition or the meaning. And I claim that this tier is made up of only 1 component, which I call the est component. I borrowed this term from the Latin word est, which is the 3rd person of the verb to be in Latin. Since constitutive statements are definitional, the most common verb found in this kind of sentences is the verb to be in the 3rd person. However, there are other kinds of verbs as well, as, for instance, means, defines, counts, etc. The tier number 3 contains the predicate component, which is the part of the statement that provides or explains the meaning and the characteristics of the subject. And the fourth tier contains the set of conditions under which the element and their meaning and properties are established. It is usually contains the temporal, geographical, and contextual qualifiers under which a concept or a subject gains its properties and meanings. And finally, I consider there is a need to add a final element, which is the or else. I claim that all constitutive statements have an implicit or a tacit or else, meaning that the subject must comply with the properties and parameters given or stated by the predicate and conditions in the constitutive statements. See, for instance, this sentence: a forest is a large area covered with trees, so we can say that the tacit or else can be expressed as, or else it is not a forest and it is not recognized as such for these regulations. So in summary, the Ecosyntax consists of 6 elements: the subject extent, the est, the predicate, conditions, and the tacit or the implicit or else. Just a minute. In order to test the Ecosyntax, I applied it to a set of legislations of Paraguay. To do this, I did a search on the online database of the National Library and Archives for the National Congress of Paraguay. In my search, I used the words forest, forest resources, forestry, natural resources, environment, environmental services, forest land, and forest users. It is noted that I excluded laws that were the result of international treaties or agreements because I wanted to focus on the concept formation of forests by national authorities and the local government. As a result of this search produced 15 legislations to be studied. And also it is important to mention that all these legislations were written in Spanish. So the analysis was done also in Spanish. I only translated some quotations to add to this study. So the data analysis consisted in 4 steps that were based on some guidelines developed by some scholar from the associated with the IGRI. So the first step was the identification and extraction of institutional statements. I did this based on the guidelines by Basurto et al. 2010. The step 2 was differentiating statements into constitutive and regulatory statements. Also, I based on guidelines from Basurto. And it is noted that I did not do any coding of the regulatory statements. I only focused on the constitutive statements. Once I had all the constitutive statements, I applied the Ecosyntax to partition these statements into each of their components as the subject extent, the est, the predicate, and the conditions. Finally, once identified all relevant institutional statements, along with the partition of their components, I proceeded to the aggregation of data and organized them into tables to display the most common themes and the most relevant ones. And the application of this study produced the following results. First of one, the application of the ESPECO syntax helps us to identify the different types and functions of constitutive statements. We found that constitutive statements not only create concepts and entities, but they also provide definition, establish characteristics, and define functions and chores. It is frequently mentioned within the literature that there is not a clear understanding on what exactly are constitutive statements. In fact, some scholars claim that the difference between constitutive statements and regulatory statements is only linguistics. However, my findings show that from these 4 types of constitutive statements, only one of them can be claimed to have similar attributes and functions to those of regulatory statements. And these are the constitutive statements defining chores or functions. See, for instance, the following example. The attributions of the enforcement authority are to promote the creation of local groups and to support national protected areas. So this statement is establishing a chore or a function and is establishing for who. So now we have an action to be carried out and we have who is going to do this action. And as this is established by law, we claim that there is an implicit deontic involved. Therefore, rephrasing this sentence into the enforcement authority may promote the creation of local groups and support national protected areas, we now have an attribute, a deontic, and an aim. And we have a sentence that is regulating behavior, that is saying who is going to do what. Following on, the second result I got from applying the Ecosyntax was the possibility to at least try to quantify the relationship among constitutive statements, regulatory statements, and total institutional statements. So in this table, I'm displaying the ratios or the amount of constitutive statements per total institutional statements. And we found that in most legislation, the amount of constitutive statements and regulatory statements are not balanced. In fact, very few of them have balanced ratios as ratios among between 0.5 and 0.6. So what this might be telling us is that the policymaking processes is focusing more on reshaping regulations than on creating new concepts or creating new processes of regulation. I believe that there is a need to do a deeper study to have conclusive remarks on this, but I found this interesting to share anyways. And finally, the application of the ESPECO syntax helped to identify the changes in the definition of forest by the Paraguayan legislations. I found that constitutive statements in Paraguayan laws have changed the way forests are defined. They became more sophisticated. It went from a simple sentence with just one condition and a very broad meaning to another conceptualization where a set of many conditions were given to forests. So one may think that because it became more sophisticated, it might help protect the forest better, but it is not always the case. What we found is that these definitions are more focused on numbers than on representing the forest as the social ecological system it is. For instance, it provides even the minimum extension of land and the number and maturity of trees that a forest must have, but it does not provide any specific condition protecting native trees and the native fauna and flora associated with them. In fact, when cross-referencing, the concept of forest with other definitions related to forest, we found the definition of forestation and reforestation, and that the plantations of exotic trees might be as lawfully recognized as a forest, as a pre-existing forest, as it were planted with native trees. So this might explain why the eucalyptus plantations have increased more than doubling past forest coverage in the last decades, which I think is problematic since eucalyptus are considered to deplete groundwater and to degenerate, to make that soil lose their fertility when planted in exotic environments. And finally, I found that laws are defining forests, but they are failing to define users, uses, or a social ecological system. In fact, when looking at the meanings or characteristics given to forests, we found statements like, for instance, forests are of public interest, forests are of social interest, but they are short to explain what are these social and public interests. And also, they do not consider in any constitutive statement, we did not find any statement defining the cultural or religious importance that forests might have for their users. And we also did not find constitutive statements establishing whether communities were allowed or not to craft their own rules to manage their forests. So certainly, forests are not conceived as a complex social ecological system where users, resource units, and governance systems must be taken into account. So in summary, the application of the Ecosyntax helped us to identify the types and functions of constitutive statements. Also, when applying to the case of forest laws in Paraguay, it helped us to identify that the definition of forests and forest resources are missing many important components, as for instance, the recognition that forest users exist. In fact, I found that the current policymaking process may have the potential on becoming tools to bureaucratize nature more than protecting nature, meaning that policies might be used to give or to establish convenient definitions in ways that nature can be administered to fulfill particular agendas or actors. So finally, I propose that the concept formation of forests, of what is a forest, what is to be protected, why does it need to be protected, and for whom, should be incorporated in the laws to represent the complexity and the diversity of forests. That is to consider users, governance systems, and social and ecological features of the forest. So finally, I would like to recommend some points for future research. For instance, in the laws I studied, as mentioned in the method section, I did not include international treaties or agreements, which is very important. Then I recommend that in future studies, could compare definitions crafted by international canons of laws and the definitions crafted by local and national governments. It could be studied, for instance, how international policies influence local legislations or policies. Additionally, I think it would be interesting to study how constitutive statements and regulatory statements interact and quantify their relationship in depth. And finally, it will be interesting to see also this tool applied to different settings, like different countries, different type of policies or legislations, and different language. So that is all on my part. Thank you very much for being here. And I will appreciate any suggestions, questions, because I'm here to learn. So thank you for joining me here today. And thank you to Saba and to Yuta for having me here. I'm very happy to share my research with you because I learned a lot from your research as well. So I leave the floor open to questions.
Thank you, Silvana.
Thank you.
Any questions from the audience for Silvana?
Hi, Professor Saba.
Well, actually, I saw Hannah's hand. Hannah, you can go ahead first.
Okay.
Thank you, thank you. I have listened with most interest, greatest interest to this presentation, especially as I am a lawyer by my first degree, and I found for the first time, this concept applied so strictly to legal regulations. And my question to you, Silvana, is, and I'm sorry because I probably missed first 2 minutes of your introduction. Do you have a legal background or did you take courses on legal methodology?
No, I do not have. However, and one of the members of my committee, Professor Mark, he does have a background in legal. Okay. But no, this is just my passion.
Okay, okay. So if I may suggest something.
Yes.
Here, because this is a very interesting situation and a very interesting study, but an important here issue is if you study legal regulations is to understand how law is being drafted and how law is being implemented. Because there are some, I have some troubles here. As I myself try to use grammar of institutions and institutional analysis for legal conventions, for international law. I am asking myself, and this is also maybe a question to you, but I don't have a real answer maybe, also, is whether, what is the added value of doing this kind of comparison through the ESPECO system and using regulative and constitutive statements in order to drive to a conclusion that the definition of forest has changed in time. You could easily do it without applying grammar of institution because it's a simple comparative analysis of definitions that change in time. So I think that this is something that is missing here. So I would ask as a lawyer, why shall I use grammar of institutions to drive to this conclusion? And then some remarks you made regarding why these legal acts are not referring to international conventions. Well, usually this is how the law operates, that through the so-called osmosis, you have some ideas that come from international law, like for example, Convention on Biological Diversity or UNCLOS or other treaties. They, through the osmosis, come to national legal regulations, but national legal regulations are separate from international law in many cases, unless they implement international conventions. So they do not have to use definitions or concepts that are embedded in international law. And then I also believe that the crucial aspect here is a language aspect. With legal text analysis, especially if you translate from Spanish to English, this is, and I have the same troubles also when I do analysis in Polish language and Polish legal texts. This is super important to understand the key legal terms in order not to translate them in an improper manner that would blur the meaning. Because law is, it creates a very specific language. So sorry for this too long comment maybe, but also a question, what is really the added value of the grammar of institution for this kind of research? Thank you very much for this very interesting research.
No, thank you very much for your comments and your suggestions, and I'm really learning a lot from them. So what I think, at least why I got interested in the grammar of institutions and to get into the much trouble of looking like at every sentence of the legislation was because I wanted it to be more digestible, like for stakeholders and policymakers like myself, who we are not lawyers, but we also take part sometimes in the policy making. And we sometimes have to make changes or suggestions. So what I wanted to see is by applying like a very automatized or mechanics way of looking at legislation, I could identify in my mind, like relating to biology or DNA, what are the genes or what are the mechanics that are making this definition inconvenient or that might have some shortcomings when applied or when related to what is a forest by the people. I don't know, it was more like trying to study how these things are defined and how me, a normal person or other common people from very common and broad backgrounds could see, okay, so this is the way something is defined. So there might be some conditionals that make these definitions and that are excluding this other definition. So it will be very easy to show to people. So I don't know if that explains your question. And I also think that if you are going to do this by hand, it does not have any sense comparing with doing any other kind of research. However, these have the potential to be automatized by machine learning, and that is part of the work that I understand the IGRI is doing already. So I think this is not a final end, but this is a building block of what could be the grammar of institution for stakeholders and for applying it in the field of policy studies or for government workers like myself. So that was my reason for using this approach.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't react because I didn't want to take the floor, but thank you. I believe that's a good explanation. I'm only thinking that maybe grammar of institution is better for other needs than looking at definitions. And maybe the situation of actors in the system is better understood through this tool than the definitions themselves, but I might be wrong.
Sorry, so, from which tool? Sorry, I did not listen. You say that another tool was more appropriate for looking at definitions. So
I was just thinking that definitions, at least as how I understand the grammar of institutions, is not the most effective way to see the reason to use the grammar of institutions. So I would not look into definitions that much. I would rather focus on the position in the regime of different actors and their possibilities to act. Because I think that with the definition of the forest that you have used, you may do this analysis by simple legal comparison, by simple legal comparative analysis. But that's only thing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see there is.
May I just respond to this, Uta?
Saba, yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to jump the line. I'll save my questions for later, but I just wanted to comment and reflect on this based on our own experience working with the constitutive syntax. And I think one way to think about, well, two things that come to mind, Hannah, in response to your really helpful comments are, one, I think that definition in this sense is construed in a wider sense of constitution more broadly. And the constitution itself can be more than definition in the strict sense, in the terms of, right, just this is describing what a particular term means, but definition could actually be the more broad constitution of aspects of these institutional systems. And to that effect, you know, they play this very critical role. So insofar as the Constitution can refer to the establishment of entities, the conference of institutional meaning, the boundaries of the institutional system, all of those kinds of definition, or what I would, you know, more broadly characterize as constitution, are so critical in institutional systems that I think it might be useful to think about that in a bit broader definition itself, in a bit broader terms, to see the utility. But then the other thing I think about, what leverage do we get from using this like micro this micro level analysis is not simply from the parsing, but rather from the aggregation that comes following the parsing. So in the one sense, you know, you take these statements that are in themselves really important statements for understanding what happens in institutional systems, you break them into their component parts. But for me, the interesting thing about the institution then comes from then aggregating that back up, summarizing the institutional kind of information that corresponds to the different syntactic components to understand what is this institution doing more broadly and what are the critical functions of it. So it's not then just about, you know, what is being defined in this particular statement or what's being constituted more broadly in this particular statement, but rather what all is being defined through this institution. And in effect, right, how then are these statements working together to basically parameterize the entire institutional space in which actors are then going to subsequently be making decisions and acting and so forth. So I guess just adding on to Silvana's response to your question, I see two potential pathways of thinking about this. One is, you know, what do you get from thinking about constitution in the wider sense, but then also what do you get from the aggregation of syntactic information that tells us something about the importance of institutions? But anyway, that's just my sense. Silvana, please feel free to disagree with this.
No,
this is my own sidebar.
No, I totally agree with Professor Saba. And also another point that like is what I think why it's important, like to go and look like with a microscope every word and how it's worded, is because this way we have the potential to translate it into numbers, into codes. That is, like, I don't have any concluding remarks to show you right now, but as it is like it's wrote in a code, and that code can be represented by a number. And this is what I want to show later, but I still don't have concluding remarks, but I think that would be like a good reason to do this, like to take all the trouble to do this. And I hope we can find that final relationship of how to quantify them, but still it's a work in progress, hopefully later. But yeah, I totally understand your question. I questioned myself when I was doing the why I'm getting into all this trouble, but it really helped me, and I think it has potential for future. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation. And thank you again for your question and your suggestions.
Yeah. I see Arthur's hand, but there was Tehendra had raised his hand before, and I didn't know if he still has a question. Tehendra? If I'm not mispronouncing your name. Okay, well, then Arthur, you next.
Yeah, just a quick point. Thanks for letting me intervene on this. Just a quick thought about using ESPECO for law statements. I was just thinking, is it possible to also perhaps use this grammar to include social norms, for example, that have different structures? And that way you could have different integrate, or as Saba Siddiq said, aggregate different sources of information on forest perception, also from the population perhaps. That would include different usages of forests, socio-economic, like livelihoods, recreation, health, collective identity, empowerment, but also looking at ecosystem services. And could ESPECO, maybe I'm wrong, could it be used to aggregate these different sources of statements? And that way you could go beyond that trouble of just being restricted to definitions or legal definitions. That's just a quick question.
Yeah, I haven't done in practice, like gone to like a committee of agricultures or forest owners to try to craft definition with them. So in practice, I don't know if this is going to work, but part of getting into doing a grammar for constitutive statement was that to make it available to people like in their communities to craft their definitions and to see if these definitions are related to the ones that we have in the laws or in the policies, or also like a tool to craft definitions with stakeholders. So I really hope that this can be used in the practice, and that was one of the objectives of doing a grammar for constitutive statements, but I haven't tried yet. So I don't know. I think it might be easier than with regulatory statements, since the way that people define things are a little bit more straightforward, but I don't have any evidence right now to give you. But thank you very much for the question and the suggestion.
Thanks to you. Very interesting work.
Thank you very much.
I think there might be a question in, yeah, there's a question in the chat from Tahendra to Silvana. What kind of gap did you find in terms of legality of forest definition?
Oh.
What kind of, go ahead.
Well, what I don't think if I understand the question well, but like if something that is, everything that is in the law is legal, right? So right now what we have is that we lost native forests, but we are having lots of plantation of exotic trees and they are also a forest. So at the end, this legislation, I mean, it is legal, but our forests are, we are losing, in fact, we are losing forests, native forests. So I think that will be a gap in the legality of this definition. Sorry, there is someone going on in the streets. I'm gonna. So what I wanted to draw attention to the fact that, I mean, these kind of definitions, instead of protecting like the native trees or native forests of Paraguay, are jeopardizing their situation from my point of view. But I don't know, Tijendra, sorry, I'm not good with pronunciation. I don't know if I really answer anything, but thank you very much for your question and for listening to my presentation.
He said thanks. So I think you answered the question. Hannah, did you want to have another question? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. It was a tricky question, so it was hard to answer. For me as a lawyer, I also was like thinking, oh, how to answer it.
Lawyer.
Yeah, but also one thing came to my mind when you were explaining the real problems with the legal application of legal regulation. Is that what you usually have, and this might be a potentially very interesting field to check with the grammar of institutions and with ESPECO, is the judicial, the courts decisions, because law includes something what we call general clauses, as you yourself mentioned in the conclusions, but there are terms in these legal regulations that are not precisely defined, like what it means political use or cultural issues or religious ground for using forest. It will never be defined, and thanks God for it, because otherwise we will lose the possibility to generally apply law to very different situations. So a good regulation is a regulation, but you may apply to different situations. Too precise regulation is a very risky one. And then here you have the role of courts, administrative courts or whatever courts in Paraguay deal with the forest regulation. And here I would be super interested to see how judicial statements are and what kind of statements in terms of constitutive and regulative are to be understood from judicial statement and judicial understanding on how to apply this legal regulation. So maybe this might be a kind of a tool or a new potential for your project. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for coming into, and we really appreciate the insight from someone from the field of the law. So I have learned already too much today, so thank you. And also I agree with her, because actually I prefer the first definition of forest that gave more space to define forest than the second one that is very with a lot of conditions that instead of including, they seem to be more excluded and in the wrong way, in my biased opinion. But yeah, I see her point, and I really agree with her. I think there was a question, Arthur, or I saw a hand.
Arthur, did you have another question?
It seems like not.
Oh. No, it was me. It was a mistake from
okay.
Zoom. Oh, sorry.
I seen a comment here from Silvana Peralta. I'm gonna read it. Sorry, it's taking me some time to read it all because English is not my first language, obviously. So just a minute, please. Sustainable development. Well, regarding the question from Silvana, what I think it would be interesting actually to see how these obligations and concepts that come from like transnational or bigger governance system relate to the ones that we have here. And do we have can we craft different rules and how we will be able to negotiate with them? I think actually this will be a very interesting field to research using the grammar of institutions, either regulatory and constitutive statements, to see the relationship between and the influence that these international governance systems have on our own local government. And to the second question, that if I think there is a fuzzy distinction between both of them, yeah, I think it's very fuzzy. I now that I was able to partition the different types and functions of constitutive statements, it helped me to better approach them. Because when I see a constitutive statement that is defining, creating concepts or characteristics, and I see them very different from regulatory statements. I see they do not have the same function at all. But when I have to look at statements that are establishing chores or functions, I actually would like to approach them more using like the ABDICO syntax, because what I think what is important to see them is not the way they are being defined, but for whom they are constraining or allowing an action to do. So I don't know, I think my explanation was even more confusing, but that's my thoughts. Like when I see definitions that are talking about functions or chores, I would rather approach them as a regulatory statement. Thank you very much for your question, Siobhan. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced your name. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? No. Oh, Saba, go ahead.
Hi. Yes, Silvana, just echoing what others have said, I found your presentation really fascinating and really interesting and really helpful. As you know, we've been thinking about the constitutive syntax, Chris Franz and I, and along with Uta and others, for some time, and it seems we have arrived at some very similar kinds of conclusions. And I guess one question I have for you is about your challenges with the syntax. So when you were coding your institutions with according to the constitutive syntax, where did you encounter challenges? Were there particular, other than, the kinds of statements that you indicated that, maybe confused with constitutive regulatory, were there other kinds of statements you encountered that were clearly constitutive but were challenging to code with the syntax?
Yes, and for instance, when I have to partition the statement into every one of their components, like subject, conditions, predicates, in some part, at least in the Spanish wording, I was not sure, is this a predicate, it is giving a meaning, or this is a condition? So that was also tricky, and I think it's like a shortcoming of trying to like compartmentalize them as you have mentioned in some of the studies you have done, that to look more at the idea than like trying to compartmentalize everything sometimes make that the idea is lost. So that was a tricky part that I found as well.
Yeah.
So it needs refining, and sometimes you use this to try to make it simple and to identify the conditions that are given to a definition, but sometimes you get more confused.
So, yeah, definitely.
So I see an example from Maria Pedraza. I'm gonna see if I find one from my presentation. Just a minute, please, Maria. Well, I will share here. Well, even here in where I put this, that a forest is a native ecosystem regenerated by natural succession or other forest techniques. I was actually not very sure if this by natural succession or other forest techniques is actually a condition, because it's establishing the how. It could be like a how condition, how it is done. So this could be an example where I was having trouble where to situate them, if this should be like here in the predicate sections or in the condition section. So I hope that helps to answer the question from Saba and to Maria as well. Well, how did I solve it? Well, I just flip a coin and no. So I was thinking that if I just, I don't know how to how to answer that, because it was actually tricky one for me. I just went with leaving it in the predicate because it seems like it helped to make the idea round, but I really think this one is like very highly can be very highly contested where to put that particular definition or wording.
Silvana, I don't know if it's helpful to you, but we've encountered this question. We use slightly different languages for it, but we think about what is being constituted and then sort of properties of those things that are being constituted, and it's those properties that sometimes get confused with the conditions. And the way we tend to think about that is, are the properties basically describing what is being constituted, or are they somehow or is the clause basically qualifying or telling you how the constitution actually should be undertaken? And so in this case, this is more like a description. It's basically describing what is being defined here.
I thank you very much for helping me with this. I see that because it is not qualifying or conditioning something.
Right, it's not conditioning the definition, if you will. Yeah.
So I don't know, I hope this helps Paola and Maria to at least try to answer the question. But this is one of the most difficult part of trying to apply it. And I think that will help. This is like to apply to bigger and bigger amounts of studies, like apply to more and more legislation, more and more policy, so we can really see how the language is being used and how they behave. So we can really craft the rules and the guidelines and how to define them. So I think more work will help clarify, or at least to specify, like this could be an exception, or but I don't know. I hope that answered the question.
Great. Well, Silvana, thank you so much for that great presentation, and thank you to everyone for your engaging questions and discussions. We are out of time, but thanks for being here, and we'll see you again October 5th for our next presentation, which will be by Raul Pacheco Vega. So we'll see you then. Thank you.